Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Pharmademix Podcast. This is the pilot episode of the Pharmademix Podcast. I am Rose Yesha. I'm the founder of Pharmademix. I am privileged to have Dylan Lundgren here with us today. Dylan is a TEDx speaker as well as an addiction recovery advocate. He works with individuals and organizations to increase outcomes for addiction recovery, as well as to facilitate improved long-term outcomes. Dylan has been in recovery himself since 2004, and he has worked in the addiction treatment industry since then. Welcome, Dylan, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Rose, and I'm glad we get a chance to serve your community and my community today. It's really cool to kind of come together and collaborate on this issue because I think there's a lot of overlap between both of our experiences, and we can, both of us, I think, have a lot to bring to the table and also can learn a lot. So I'm excited to get into this discussion today.
Yeah, I'm definitely excited as well. And, it's really nice to be able to learn from you. And also just to, think about this intersection between dependency and addiction, because I know that historically there's just been so much ambiguity between these two terms. So I know with the opioid epidemic, which has been so severe, especially in the past decade, this is all we hear about in the news, on Facebook, other outlets on social media. And it's certainly getting the attention that it deserves. Even in my own county, if I go to the county police page, they actually have a tally of how many people daily have either, overdosed or actually died from opioids. Now, what a lot of people don't realize is that with opioid fatalities, over 33% of these fatalities involve an individual who has both an opioid and a benzodiazepine in their system. So we have this benzodiazepine crisis, but it's, unfortunately, it's, in the shadows, right? And so I have actually had the privilege of being an administrator in a benzodiazepine community, specifically the Benzodiazepine Warrior Community. And what we do is very unique. So we do weekly roundtable Zoom discussions where our members can talk to the administration team, they can talk to other members, they can share their story. I mean, I almost think about it as like the NA of benzo meetings, if that makes sense, because we don't really fit, we don't fit in the addiction category. So NA is not really an option for us. It just doesn't, it doesn't work because most of us are dependent and not addicted. So we're dealing with a lot of, issues. In addition, we also look to the Heather Ashton manual. So Professor Heather Ashton, she wrote this manual on benzodiazepine dependency, all the issues that people go through, how to microtaper off of benzodiazepines, central nervous system damage. And so where this differs is that, with opioids, from my understanding, is that there's a lot of treatment options, right? So there's Suboxone, methadone, there's other options. For benzodiazepines, typically there's a crossover to like a longer acting benzo, like Valium, for example. But the withdrawal symptoms from benzodiazepines can last for years. So this is very different. I mean, we have people who are in protracted withdrawal, and it might be like, 2 years from the last time they took a benzodiazepine, for example, but they're still experiencing withdrawal symptoms. And so in the Benzodiazepine Warrior Community, and we have about 1,500 members, so we're like one of the biggest benzodiazepine support networks on Facebook.
Awesome.
Yeah, I know, it is awesome. So it's a privilege to be an admin there. When I first discovered like the benzo support communities, I just felt like so desperate for help, and I could have never, I mean, maybe you felt this way too. Like, when you're sick on your own, like you could have never imagined that you would end up being somebody who could help other people. And so it's really amazing what we've accomplished, especially like the founder of the community. I mean, she's created all these units to, discuss all the various aspects of benzodiazepine tolerance, dependence, and withdrawal, and also creating the social aspect. Like we have a chat, we have like the weekly Zoom meetings. So it's just like, it's really incredible. But the one thing that is really lacking for those of us who are dependent on benzodiazepines is like, any kind of medical help or real treatment. So we've had members who have gone to detox, they've tried rehab, and it either didn't help or it actually made things worse. Because the reality of the situation is that you might have to taper benzodiazepine for years. So you can't go to a detox and get off in like 10 days or 30 days or even 90 days. Like I've talked to people who are still tapering after 6 years.
Wow.
So yeah, wow, I know it's insane. So, we almost feel like, outsiders in the community because a lot of people don't understand our affliction, right? And like doctors gaslight us. They kind of tell us that we're mentally ill or it's psychosomatic. Addiction recovery centers will probably take us in, but they can't really do much for us. So it's just really tough. But like when I think about, addiction recovery, I think like, could there be a place for treatment for us, because we don't have that right now.
Yeah. Wow. That's yeah, there's so much there to unpack.
Yeah.
And the first thing that comes up for me is just the amount of respect I have for anybody who's willing to go through the process that you're going through and gone through, and how hard that must be. Because I know even having a lot of support to go through any type of major change, whether it's addiction or, coming off of a dependence, is hard. Even with support, it's really hard. And so to not have support or not have the type of help that's necessary to get to the other side, I think is even harder. And that being said, it's not impossible. And there are some resources out there to help, which I'll get into, and I'm sure we can talk more about from both of our perspectives. What I think of in regards to a lot of what you said was that there's definite overlaps between dependence and addiction. And not so much in that if someone's dependent, they're addicted. There's a difference. But what I mean is a lot of the things that help people change any type of chemical relationship that they don't want anymore are similar across the board. And a lot of the things that happen in the treatment industry from mental health or substance use challenges are similar across the board. And a lot of those things don't help. So for example, when we go into treatment for addiction, nowadays, in many places, chances are you're going to be prescribed a good amount of psychiatric medications.
Yes.
And you might be prescribed a benzo if you're having anxiety. And for a normal person, this could be an issue. But for an addict, not an addict, it's not the right way to put it. For someone who's an individual struggling with a substance use disorder, it can be a lethal choice to take a benzo. And some people don't know this, but in the year 2000, and let me back up really quick. So I got into this issue, and I think we got connected because of the bigger picture of how medications are being used and how at times it just doesn't help and it actually harms.
Okay.
And so I became curious about that because of my work in the addiction treatment field and the amount of medications I was seeing being prescribed to people in addiction treatment as part of their addiction treatment process. And when I started to explore, like, how is this possible? How do we give somebody who's trying to get away from addiction a substance that's going to promote a separate addiction?
Yes.
And so what I found was an act in 2000 called the Drug Addiction Treatment Act.
Okay.
What the Drug Addiction Treatment Act did was it allowed physicians to prescribed controlled medications. So basically narcotic, potentially addictive medications to people seeking recovery from addiction. Now, one of those medications was, one class of those medications was benzodiazepines. And if we look at from the year 2000 until now, the benzodiazepine prescriptions were tripled, and fatal overdoses, check this out, were quadrupled since that law was passed. So I believe, and this is just my opinion, this part of it, but I believe that because of the intersection between dependence and addiction, that when people try to get off something, that oftentimes nowadays they're prescribed something that can be just as harmful and lead to a separate issue, whether that's issue is dependence, whether that issue is addiction, or whether that issue is some type of side effect, that could be a whole list of things. And that's not everybody, but that's kind of where we come together. We're struggling with how do we help people that have taken something that's now hurting them and they're having trouble getting off that thing, right? So the difference, the last thing I'll say is the difference between dependence and addiction, I think, is really summed up well from the perspective of one of the recovery literature books called The Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous talks about alcoholism, which is another way of saying addiction, is summed up in two ways. It's a physical dependence, but it's also a mental obsession.
Okay.
So it's a physical craving combined with a mental obsession. So if someone just has a physical dependence, then they're going to physically withdraw, right? If they stop taking it, there's going to be a little withdrawal. But if they get through that withdrawal or detox process, then they can just stay away from it, right?
Yeah.
The difference with someone who's in full-blown addiction is after that withdrawal process, they're going to have a thought. Maybe I can do it again. Maybe I can just do it one more time. Maybe and they'll, despite massive consequences. So someone could get a DUI, smash up their car, hurt themselves, hurt somebody else, and there'll be a tremendous amount of remorse, regret, shame, guilt. And so they'll stop. But after they stop for a little while, that mental obsession, the peculiar mental twist is what they call it in the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, happens. And all of a sudden they have like a blank spot where it's like, you know what? I can just do it again. It wasn't that bad.
Okay.
And so does that make sense?
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And thank you for, providing me with all of that knowledge. Because I think that, as a society at large, we're just looking at the news, we're looking at media coverage, we're looking at, how addiction is portrayed in Hollywood. And it's so far from what is actually happening. Like I didn't even know that I had a chemical dependence until 2 years ago. I just thought I had anxiety and that I was getting treatment for it. I was never told that benzodiazepines were even habit forming. And I remember like asking my doctor, like, if they had side effects. And I mean, unequivocally, every medical professional would kind of tell me no. Anecdotally, I had someone close to me go to rehab, and I had been through my first Klonopin withdrawal at this time. Although at the time I didn't know it was Klonopin withdrawal because my doctors were telling me that my side effects are part of my mental illness, which is actually, unfortunately, very typical for most of us in the benzodiazepine dependent community. But in my mind, when I met people, so, I would go to the family weekends in rehab. I'm sure you're familiar with that, given your profession. And I would meet people there who were solely there for benzodiazepines. And I thought that they were abusing them. Like, I just thought, okay, well, I took them as prescribed, and these people are probably here in rehab because they abused them. And now I'm realizing like, no, like they probably were there for, being dependent on a dosage that was taken as prescribed. And I think that's why it's so important to make that distinction, because people need to realize, like, you can take an as prescribed dosage of a benzo, right? And still get into a lot of trouble. I mean, it
Yeah.
can still totally like fuck up your life.
Yeah,
Yeah. And I
definitely.
think that that's where it's so important to make that distinction. I think for me, I use the word chemical dependence, even though it can be conflated with addiction. But to me, it's like the chemical is the catalyst, right? And I think even if we were to use like different language, like as soon as you say the word dependent, and like I've talked to different people, like say I'm talking to like a friend, or say I'm like, talking to a new guy I'm trying to date, like as soon as I say the word dependent, they're going to think I'm an addict.
Hmm.
So it's like people just don't, if they haven't, walked in my shoes, so to speak, like they just don't understand the difference. They just think like, okay, Rose is taking the substance every day. She can't get off of it. They don't understand that it's not an addiction. Now, I do want to share that I have been addicted as well. And it was as a result of my dependence. And this is not something that's all that rare. So I was cold turkeyed off of about 2 milligrams of Klonopin, and my symptoms were so horrendous that I don't know how I avoided like ending up in the psych ward. Like somehow I avoided it, but I ended up getting addicted to Benadryl, which is another drug they say is not habit forming. They even have it on the bottle, like non-habit forming, right? So at first I took like 2, and then 2 became 4, and then 4 became 20. So at some point I was taking up to 20 pills of Benadryl a day. I was also prescribed gabapentin to deal with my nerve pain from the cold turkey.
Oof.
And at first I was taking like 1800, and then 1800 became 3600. And before I knew it, I was taking 6,000 milligrams of gabapentin and up to
Wow.
20 pills of Benadryl a day. Um,
Wow.
and at the time, I just thought, oh, well, I'm in a lot of pain. So, like, this makes sense to be doing this, right? And I didn't realize that I was forming this addiction. But I think that because I've been both dependent and addicted, I do understand the difference, because I remember like having cravings. Like, I remember feeling like, I would take so like Benadryl is basically the same thing as Unisom, and it's something you take to go to sleep for a lot of people. I would take it in the morning. Like I would wake up and take this very sedating drug, and I would kind of rationalize it. Like, okay, well, I'm in a lot of pain, and, I have all these intrusive thoughts from benzos. And I didn't realize, like, it wasn't conscious that I was actually craving the drug. Now, when I think about benzos, like I never craved benzos, and I never took more than prescribed. Like I think there might have been 1 or 2 occasions where I might have taken like a pill or 2 extra, but I never abused benzos. Like I never felt like I really like needed to take them. All I knew was that I couldn't stop taking them, because that would mean I would go into withdrawal. So I think
Mhm.
that it's really important, like as you said, like this intersection between dependence and addiction. Like we need to be really conscious of that. And we also need to be conscious of the stigma. Because like if you watched my Pharmademix Connect live that I did a couple of weeks ago in early January, I talked about the fact that, in the benzo community, some people are having this huge pushback against like, no, we're not addicts. And like, I see where they're coming from, because it's important to have that distinction. But in a way, they're kind of creating the stigma, because it's kind of like, well, how are addicts supposed to feel, or people who have substance abuse disorders, when people are getting so worked up about having that label.
Yeah, yeah, and a couple of things there. So one is we're human, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's across the board. So there's not really a huge difference to me between someone who's dependent and someone who's struggling with addiction. It's just
Mm-hmm.
it's like a severity of the same issue, which
Right.
is there's a relationship with a substance that we don't want to have, and yet we're kind of caught in that. And the extent to which that we act out of that codependent relationship is the extent to which we'll label it dependence or addiction. But it's not like, we're in this category over here, and then it's like, dude, no, we're at least that's the way I see it. We're human. We struggle with things. We're all kind of victims of big pharma to an extent.
Yeah.
And so I think that when we can come together and realize that, we have a much better shot at gaining some type of critical mass, because a lot of the similar things that are happening with benzos now, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds very similar, is what happened with the Oxycontin back in the early 90s.
Right.
So in the early 90s, Oxycontin was a big part, not the sole reason, but a big motivator for the current opiate crisis. And the way that showed up was, here's this amazing pill, not addictive, like, okay, maybe one in a million, right? But that's like so rare. And so this is the magic pill for pain. Everybody should be using it. Here's a few stories of a diverse population that we're going to blast on media. And, any pushback is stigma. So if you say, hey, these pills, well, I noticed some people are actually selling them on the street. They're cooking them up and shooting them up. People are overdosing on them. None of that information is making it to the right source. It's all, and so fast forward 20 years, now we have the opiate crisis, which isn't any better. It's actually getting worse. In fact, right now, every state almost, I'd have to look further into it, but I know that a lot of states, I was going to say almost every state, but I know a lot of states have increased their overdoses. And right now we have record overdoses.
Wow.
But if you connect that to the modus operandi of how the system operates, and in some ways, the medical system operates really well, and it's awesome. And there's some really good doctors out there. And I'm not telling somebody to start or stop a medication. It's not my place. But I think it is my place and our place to share relevant information and unknown solutions that aren't being discussed. And some of that relevant information is the kind of shadow side of how the industry operates. So when somebody says, hey, I'm a doctor, this isn't addictive, should you absolutely trust them? I would say question mark.
Yeah.
I would say you don't want to necessarily trust somebody you don't know, without, especially a doctor, without being clear on their track record, their conflicts of interest, their core beliefs. Do they take a study at face value, or do they actually explore where the study is coming from? These are some of the problems, because right now, and once again, I think benzos are a huge part of this. And someone can come into treatment for addiction and then get addicted to benzos. Not that everyone who takes a benzo is addicted, but if you have a chemical, anybody who's going through a process of recovery has to go through a really tough process, especially at first, because our biology resets to a level where it's comfortable to be at a certain level. Meaning, like, dopamine has to be a certain level, endorphin, like all these chemicals have to be at a certain level for me to be comfortable. So let's say a normal person was like at 100.
Yeah.
Well, with certain medications or drugs, we only feel comfortable now at 300.
Okay.
So when we stop taking those medications, well, our body and mind goes back to 100, but that doesn't feel normal anymore, because we've changed our brain to a place where only 300 feels normal.
So is that
now,
like with the pain
hold on
receptors?
1 second. Yeah, just give me 1 second. So now we feel like shit or crap. I don't know if I can say it. We feel like crap at 100, right? And so it takes a period of time for our brains to reset. But this is the healing process, and this is dependence or addiction. It's a healing process that we have to go through for our brain and body to reset, and that process is uncomfortable. And during that process, our mind and our body is going to want that 300. And the way it knows to get that is the thing we've been doing. Benzo, crack, whatever it is, it's been keeping us somewhat stable. But eventually it gets to a point where it doesn't work. That's called tolerance.
Yeah.
That's why, like, go back to the doctor. Hey, this isn't working. Oh, well, let's triple your dose, right? Oh, cool. This works right now. And then what happens? Well, then, like you're mentioning, maybe you get to 6,000 milligrams of gabapentin. It's like, what the hell do I do now?
Yeah.
Where do I go from here? Oh, I have to get off it. Well, now I'm already way up here. And then it's like hell, as you know, to get off it. And there's ways to do it. And we can get into that.
Yeah.
But just to kind of shine a light for people from a prevention perspective of like when you're going in and someone's saying, hey, you have this disorder, you need to take this med. It doesn't have any side effects. It's not addictive. Like there is a litany of assumptions there that have been proven in some cases to be completely false. So you don't want to take it at face value, is what I'm trying to say. And there's other sources like we're talking about here that can, mitigate some of that risk.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Dylan, that's totally spot on. And I think the lack of informed consent is appalling. It's appalling that doctors are still telling patients that they can take benzos for years. When if you look at the pharmaceutical insert, it says that benzos should be taken at most for 6 weeks. And really what I've learned is that they shouldn't be taken for more than 4 weeks. And then we get these people, I'm an admin in Benzo Warrior Community. They've been on benzos for like decades. And some of them maybe have been addicted to heroin in the past, and that's how they ended up on benzos, or they've been alcoholics. And I think one of the major issues, so like, I've absorbed everything you've said, and correct me if I'm wrong, but for me, the difference that I see between opioid dependence or addiction versus benzodiazepine, which is usually dependency, I would say like in our community, the majority of our members are dependent and not addicted. We do see benzo addicts, but it's extremely rare. It's usually people who take them as prescribed. But I think the major difference here, Dylan, is that with opioids, to me, it seems like there's this escalation. Like, maybe at first people are taking what's prescribed and then it kind of gets out of control very quickly. Whereas with benzos, I feel like for the most part, people are sticking to what they're being prescribed. But correct me if I'm wrong.
Totally. It's really interesting because I've thought a lot about this because I used to, my perspective has evolved as I've stayed in recovery and worked in the field. And there would have been a period of time where I was just had a blanket statement, right? Like, they're all addicted or, whatever. And now because I've noticed the same thing. It seems like, I have friends that are having trouble getting off of, a friend who's had trouble getting off of benzos, but has never robbed or stolen to get more benzos, So it's this thing where it's like definitely something that has strong chemical hooks in terms of the dependence, physical dependence side, but it doesn't have that like mental obsession where more, regardless of what I have to do to get it, which is definitely something that happens with a lot of opiates, things that, it's probably the worst progression I've ever seen. Crack and heroin seem to be the ones that are, they make people do things they never would have done. I was a scholar athlete in high school and like voted the scholar athlete of my class, a male scholar athlete of my class, never planned on doing drugs, never, within 3 years, I was a homeless crack addict.
Wow. Well, you've certainly come a long way, Dylan.
Thanks. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. But I bring that up just to show that there is, like you're saying, there is a, yes, I agree. There is a difference,
I remember so like at some point I was just so desperate for support and I had already found the online communities, but I just needed something in person. So I decided to go to an NA meeting, a Narcotics Anonymous. And it was like me and maybe 5 other men, and all of them had been to jail. Like all of them had been to jail, had like these huge criminal histories. They had near fatal overdoses. And like, here I am with my benzo dependency. And I just felt like, oh my God, like I don't belong here. I wasn't like afraid or anything, especially because like, I had someone close to me go to rehab. So like I'm familiar with this, but it was just this total disconnect of like, are they even going to accept me? Because it's like, I don't know if I'm even comfortable coming there saying, hi, I'm Rose, I'm an addict, because I don't consider myself to be an addict. Like Was I addicted to Benadryl and gabapentin at some point? Yes, I was. I'm not anymore. But it's like, I do feel sad that there's no in-person meeting that I can go to. And I'm listening to, like, there was one guy, he had like 3 near fatal overdoses. And I think his last one, he had like compartment syndrome. He was on life support. He had been to jail. And I was like, I don't relate to any of this. Like, this has never happened to me with my benzodiazepine dependency. But it did kind of just open my eyes, because it's like that. I know we've talked about this. It's like that Macklemore song, "My drug dealer was a doctor," right? So it's like, what's the difference between me going and seeking relief from my doctor, who's like telling me this drug is safe, to the other person who's trying to get relief and getting heroin off the street? And like with gabapentin, I don't know for sure, because I've never really taken opioids. But they sell them on the street. They sell them and they're called Johnnies, right? So people sell gabapentin on the street. I have heard that if you do take enough, it's similar to an opioid high. So, you know, it's a very like chameleon drug. Like, people take it for nerve pain, but then people also take it for like bipolar disorder. I mean, it's really crazy. And so I really liked what you were talking about earlier. You're talking about these pharmacological treatments for addiction that actually can completely backfire. You know, that's how people end up, you know, in worse situations that they might have been in to begin with. Like, we have ex-heroin addicts in our Benzo Warrior community who have all told us that getting off of heroin was easier than getting off of benzos. And that blows my mind, you know, because like in school, you're just taught like heroin is like the worst fucking thing in the world. Like, you know, if you take heroin, you're going to get addicted and fucking die or go to jail or like, you know, whatever. So it's like, it just blows my mind that at 17 years old, I was prescribed a drug that was harder to come off of than heroin. And I was basically dope sick. I mean, like, that was my withdrawal experience. Like, I had fucking brain zaps, intrusive thoughts, akathisia. I mean, you name it. I mean, it was hell on earth. Like, I woke
up. You had
up.
akathisia too?
Yeah.
Oh,
so I woke up every morning, like, basically wishing I was dead, because my withdrawal was like the most inhumane thing that a person can go through. But all along the way, my doctors were telling me that my symptoms were part of like some mental illness. And deep down, I knew it wasn't true. But like, when you're so messed up from the psych drugs, you like lose the ability to even like think critically anymore, right? And if you're having these medical professionals with these fancy degrees telling you that you're mentally ill and you need to take these pills, I mean, at 17, I just kind of went with it. And I went with it for like 14 years of my life, until finally I was like, you know what? Like, there's something really fucking wrong about this. Like, I shouldn't be in treatment for so long and still feeling like shit all the time. And like, now there's all these other treatments. Like, there's like, I'm also an admin at VTAG, which is the Victims of TMS Action Group. So TMS is transcranial magnetic stimulation. And now it's being used off label to treat addiction, specifically like cocaine addiction. And what a lot of people don't know, and this is where informed consent comes back into play, is that this treatment can actually have really serious consequences. And so we're trying, you know, really trying to get these people with substance abuse disorders better, but a lot of the times we're doing more harm than good. And I guess the question I want to ask you is like, what is the interplay? Because obviously some of these, you know, pharmaceutical treatments work, but like, how can they work in conjunction with holistic medicine, like diet and exercise? And I know you've been involved in yoga practice, etc. So, you know, what is the interplay between that?
Can I ask you a question real quick before we go there? So you mentioned a couple of things I think might be helpful. So when you were going through the process of side effects and you were having akathisia, intrusive thoughts, some other things, you would go to your doctor and say, hey, like, I'm having this thing.
So at the time, I couldn't really explain what I was going through. So like, I think one of my first symptoms were brain zaps, and basically it feels like there's electricity coursing through your entire head, almost like you're having a seizure. And I don't remember how I described it. I think I mentioned the word electricity or pain.
But you did
And
mention, like,
yeah,
did
I
you
did. And
say,
every single time they told me it was psychosomatic, like it was kind of all in my head. It was part of my panic disorder. They tried to put me on more meds. I actually ended up in the psych ward because I had a bad reaction to Paxil. I actually hallucinated off of one dose of
wow,
Paxil. And so all this time I'm trying to explain to the doctors, like, hey, I think this may be the meds because I didn't have all of these symptoms before the meds, and nobody is listening to me. I mean, everyone's just treating me like I'm fucking nuts, like
and
I'm
you
crazy.
said it was, you thought it was because of the meds too. You came to that conclusion yourself.
Yeah, I did, but then I changed my opinion because when you're being told by like X amount of doctors that it's you, and they have all these labels, right? Because we have the magical DSM with all these,
All right.
disorders, and like every time it was like, you have panic disorder, you have major depressive disorder, you have bipolar disorder. And so, I mean, I was so young that it was like, who am I to question these medical, professionals? And I'm glad that I had my waking up moment, but I wish I had it, a lot sooner, obviously. Um,
Yeah, I just think it's
yeah,
helpful for people to hear the specifics of that. So you went to a doctor, you said, "Hey, I'm having this side effect. I believe and I feel it's because of the medication."
exactly.
This happened more than once,
Yep,
and every single time you were discouraged from that and pointed back to the fact it was you, not the medication. Like
exactly.
you're the problem, not the medication.
Yeah. And just to interject, there's a book by Dr. Peter Bregan about this. It's I don't remember the exact title, but I'll link it. And it's basically like, um, is your medication your problem? And that was actually something in medicating normal as well. Like nobody is asking that question. Could it be the medication?
Yeah,
And so all of
totally.
us in the Benzo Warrior community, I mean, we all it's almost boring by now because we all have the same story. It's like, we kind of knew it was the meds, but the doctors kept saying, no, you're mentally ill. It's not the meds. And we had to figure it out on our own that it was actually the medication.
So what switched for you? Like how did you finally be like, fuck it, basically, and go your own way?
I think it was because so the benzodiazepine laws changed in Maryland. Like before it was like it wasn't very strict. It was like they would even give you like a refill or two. And then I was telling my doctor, I was on 2 milligrams of Clonopin at the time. And I was telling him that, it wasn't really working anymore and I didn't really know what to do. And he fired me. Like I don't know exactly what he said, but he was basically like, well, the laws have changed and now I feel really uncomfortable. And I remember calling him to be like, hey, I'm running out of Clonopin. Like, I can't just cold turkey. And they referred me to another doctor, but like, I was so fucked up that like, there was no way I could even make the phone call to make like another evaluation. And that's when I started
Wow.
to realize, like, wait a minute, like, something is up here. Like, that was like my waking up moment of like, why did this doctor fire me after I told him I was having issues? Why is
Yeah.
he refusing to see me now? Because I haven't done anything wrong. I mean, I wasn't like belligerent, I wasn't angry or mean. And I went on Facebook and I found the support groups. And the first one I found was Beating Benzos. And there were 6,000 members there. And they all had the same exact story as me. And I was
Wow.
like, holy shit. Cause like for 14 years or 15 years, I thought I was like the only person in the world going through this. Like I had no idea there were other people out there like me.
Wow. Wow. Well, you're a warrior in my book. I know I've said that before, but I'm always deeply respectful of anybody that's willing to, do what you're doing. I mean, like you're challenging the status quo and you're doing it to save your life, but in the process I think you're inspiring a lot of people, and I'm one of those people because I know how hard that is. And to me, from what I've seen in the addiction treatment side of things is it's not so much the challenge as hard as it is to get off of a physical chemical substance that has its hooks in us. The harder part is the mentality that it's not a problem, right?
Yeah.
Like the idea that the idea that like the idea that the doctors are saying, which is,
Yeah.
oh no, it's not addictive. Oh no, like it's a complete cultural paradigm. And that seems to
Exactly.
be even harder to break than the dependence or the addiction. So when someone does break that, and you're one of those people who is challenging that paradigm, I think it's amazing, because that's really where the work has to be done. Because without that paradigm shifting, there's no work needs to be done. Like according to, you know what I mean? It's like no one thinks there's work that needs to be done. If they have a side effect, it's like, oh, I just need another medication. If there's an overdose, well, that person was just, was just an addict. So of course they were going to overdose, rather than, oh,
Yeah.
wait, did we give them something that was triggering their brain to want more of the thing that would make them overdose?
Yeah.
No one asked that question. In the same way, they don't ask the question of like, well, I've had 35 different medications. I've had 100 side effects. Maybe
Yeah.
it's the medication.
Yeah.
Like, no. This doctor with these like 3 degrees, this brilliant doctor looked at all this information and said, no, 2 + 2 does not equal 4. 2 + 2 = 6. It's like this,
Yeah.
it's a delusion, but the delusion is enabled. So the doctors get certain studies, they get certain information, and they're not and by the doctors, I don't mean every doctor, but there are definitely some doctors who are looking at this information and they're taking it at face value, and they're unconsciously buying into a delusion that's hurting a lot of people. And unless they're willing to challenge that thinking, and the only way that they do that, I think, is by people like you who have lived experience telling them over and over and over again, like, that's not true. That's not true. That's not true, and
Yeah.
not from a place of like, you're wrong, but like, look, sure, that's part of the story. Some people don't get dependent. Some people don't get addicted. Some people, gabapentin helps them. But there's also thousands of other people who are saying this is another part of the story that
Yeah.
needs to be heard. And it needs to be heard in a way that basically challenges professionals to have more discernment. So when they're going to give somebody gabapentin or a benzo, they're not only telling them what the challenge, what the problems could be in the long run, but they're also saying, maybe I won't give this to you, right? However, in a situation where they're already on it, you don't want to take somebody off benzos, but maybe there's a situation where they don't give somebody who's coming off heroin a gabapentin, a benzo, a methamphetamine, and Suboxone all at the same time. Maybe they say, hey, maybe that's a dumb choice. Maybe I shouldn't do that,
Yeah. I mean,
instead of
absolutely,
looking at a
Dylan.
paper
Yeah.
and, instead of looking at the paper and be like, no, it says here I should do it. I mean,
Yeah.
everyone else is telling me I shouldn't, but the paper says I should. So,
I mean, I remember when I was getting off Klonopin the first time, I had just graduated high school and I had a pill cutter and I got off of something like 2 milligrams of Klonopin within 7 to 10 days, which is insane considering the fact that I was already on it for 6 months. I was tolerant within 4 weeks. I mean, my taper should have been way longer. My taper might have taken a year if it was really done properly. And so it's like, here I am. And like, I mean, like I wasn't an exceptionally good student. But everyone's enjoying themselves. They're going to senior week and I'm fucking just going nuts. I'm sick as shit. Like, I want to go to college, but I'm thinking like, am I too sick to go to college? And it's just like so much was stolen from me. Like my prime years of my life were like, I should have been out partying with my friends, having fun in college, like not going through this shit, like not having relationship problems because of, being prescribed this medication. And, the flip side is that after being gaslit by dozens of doctors, I finally found a psychiatrist through Mad in America, which you're familiar with,
yep.
Who believed my iatrogenic injury. And this guy like saved my life. I mean, even just the fact that he believed me, I mean, that restored my faith because even throughout my experience, I have never become anti-psychiatry. I have become critical of psychiatry, obviously, but, forming this therapeutic relationship finally with a doctor who's like, Rose, I believe you. And he's actually even written about the subject.
Who is it? Who is this doctor?
So I can't disclose that,
Okay.
but he absolutely saved my life. I mean, if
Cool.
I had not have found him, I probably would have ended up in the hospital. Like, I'm eternally grateful to this person.
Yeah.
And it just so happened to be that, he was in my state, and it just, worked out that
Oh,
way. And, you know, there are psychiatrists who are on our side. And that's what I try to explain to
yeah.
people. Like, there are people who are anti-psychiatry. And I'm like, wait a minute. No, like, that's not the solution. Like, we need psychiatrists who believe our injury, and they do. Like, there
Totally.
are, like, Dr. Peter Bregan, who's
Yeah.
written a bunch of books, Dr. Stuart Shipko, just to name a couple.
Are
And
there
like,
ways? Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, so like, yeah, so I mean, I think that we need to keep that in mind, that there are going to be doctors on our side. Unfortunately, they're like in the minority. But maybe, with all this awareness, we can change the paradigm.
Definitely, definitely. And I would be curious to know, I think your audience or my audience probably would want to know, like, how is, I know you can't share who the doctor is, but how did you go about finding a doctor that was in line with where you want to go and could really help you?
So it was actually through Matt in America. I listened to one of his podcasts, and it just happened to be, that I could see him where I am now. And it was like,
Okay.
someone
Yeah.
someone up there was looking out for me or something, because, you know,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it was amazing. And that's very rare. I mean, like, all we hear about in the support communities are about psychiatrists who don't believe their patients, who don't believe in slow tapers, who don't believe in iatrogenic injury from benzos. So it was just
Yeah.
this amazing experience that I had. And I'm so grateful for that. But I almost feel guilty because I know not everybody gets to have that experience. But
Yeah.
hopefully, that's going to change. And I guess, just to kind of like, wrap our discussion up, I guess my last question is like, you've been in recovery for 16 years now. Congratulations. Like,
Thank
that
you.
is amazing to me. I mean, you have accomplished like a milestone that many, unfortunately, they lose the battle. They don't accomplish that. They're not able to. Um, how do you deal with the fallout? Like, I almost feel like, for me, like, once I'm fine, because I'm not off my medication yet, like, how do you deal with like PTS, like the trauma of everything you've
Mm.
gone through? Like, how do you keep going and go on with life, like, given your past experiences?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there's a high level of burnout in this field, especially right now with COVID and everything. But I have a way to deal with my own trauma, and it is slightly traumatic to be in an environment where you see somebody one day and they're dead the next. I mean, I've had to face, yeah, it's traumatic, it's traumatic. I've had to give somebody CPR and they didn't make it. And, so I have a process called fear memory integration, to get technical. It's a somatic healing process, and it's a way to deal with trauma that's really helped me out. If anyone's interested in that, they can check it out. There's a great book on Amazon called
Mm-hmm.
called Fear Memory Integration, but that's like a technical tool that people
Yeah.
can use to deal with trauma. That's
Wow, I've
helped me
never
out
heard
a
of that.
lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, it helped me out a lot. And in fact, um, yeah, it's helped a lot. And there's some other tools to use. I mean, staying connected with people that are on the same path, like, that's really helpful. And I think
Yeah.
that's something you have going for you too. Is like, yes, there's a lot of people that are, and I know I'm pretty sure this is true with the benzo community. Like, not a lot of people make it, off of benzos. It's just horrific, right? So, and yet there are some, but staying connected with people that are heading in that direction, and same thing with recovery. It's like, not many people make it, but there are some. And so I try to stay connected with those, and then help other people. But at the end of the day, the main thing for me that I've found is the difference is perseverance. So
Yeah.
by no means have I been perfect. And the only thing I've done differently or better than other people is I kept going.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, the North Star was always my direction.
Mm-hmm.
And even at times I'd doubt that, I'd forget, I'd slip up here or there on something or whatever. It's like there was still like a deep desire to just get kind of out of the weeds, you know?
Yeah.
And it's such a dark analogy, but I think about, have you ever seen, it's one of the Batman movies. I think it's Batman Begins, where he's in this like deep, dark pit.
No.
Okay.
I think I've seen The Dark Knight.
Okay. Well, in
That's
Batman
about it.
Begins, he's in this
Yeah.
like, he's confined to this, it's almost like a huge well. You know, it's like a
Mm-hmm.
humongous well. It's like a couple 100 feet. But the only way he can get out is like this crazy process using this like rope, and they has to climb with like, I don't know, it's hard to explain, but basically like he keeps trying to go up, but if he falls like 100 feet on these rocks and he gets all messed
Oh.
up. You know, it's just brutal, such a brutal analogy. But once
Mm-hmm.
he's out of the pit, he's like back in this like beautiful nature area and all that. And it's like, I think for a lot of people, especially someone like us, there's a deep desire to get out of the pit,
Yes.
and not just for ourselves, but for other people. And that desire speaks to something in us as humans that taps into something more powerful. So it's almost like a heroic archetype. And when we can tap into that and remember, like, there's a more important reason than just getting off of the thing, right? There's a more important reason than
Yeah.
just being out of pain and discomfort. There's a bigger purpose. And I think that is a thread that can kind of give us like some more umph, you know, some more power and strength to keep going when it's really hard or almost impossible to keep going. Like in those moments, the crucial moments where it's like everything in me wants to give up, like there's got to be something there, a bigger why that just gives me that 1 centimeter more that I need to keep going.
Wow, that's so motivating and inspiring, Dylan. And I like the Batman analogy. I feel like now I have to go like watch all the movies just to get even, more into the game with it. That was
Yeah.
supposed to be my last question, but I have one more, and I swear it's my final question.
Yeah, we're good.
What is happening now? So with the global pandemic, I mean, we have been hearing horror stories about people who have been sober for many years, but now because of COVID, and you can be brief about this because I know it's, multifaceted. Like, how are they supposed to get the help that they need given this global crisis?
So that's a great question. In fact, I was just checking out an article recently where in San Francisco, the overdoses have exceeded COVID by like 3 to 4 times the amount.
Wow.
So overdose deaths versus COVID deaths. Overdose deaths were like, I think 4 times, but if it wasn't 4, it was 3 or 4, one of the two, but a lot more basically. Well, with recovery and any type of major life challenge like that, from what I've experienced and noticed, is the principles at the end of the day aren't necessarily based on circumstance.
Okay.
So it can be a lot harder to change somebody's life in these circumstances, but
Okay.
it's not impossible because the principles are the same. So one
Yeah.
example of that is like accountability. So
Okay.
somebody just getting, let's say somebody's on benzos, but they're starting to taper down
Mm-hmm.
and it's really hard, right? Well, having a daily accountability measure for that taper with somebody is really important, in my opinion, because any type of physical dependence is going to require some type of accountability. Because the second we start to switch that, right, we drop down, our mind's going to want more, right?
Yeah.
And so our body is going to want more. And so we've got to have some type of accountability measure to be like, hey, I really want more today. And then other people to remind us like, all right, you got this, it's going to get better. Or, are you taking care of yourself today? Maybe take a hot shower. What makes you feel good? Like anything that kind of, smooth that process. So it's very similar with addiction, which is, farther down the spectrum, but it's very similar. Someone that's coming off of
Absolutely.
heroin, they're going to need accountability. So with COVID, what's made it harder is there's not in-person connection. And that is a missing component, but it's not necessarily helpful either to use that as an excuse. It's a very real challenge and it's a very real thing. But if we start to use that as, a reason to justify the overdoses and the relapses, it's kind of a tricky thing because it can easily become an excuse to use versus like, yes, this is a circumstance and I can't use it as any excuse because if I do, I'm screwed. right? If I start
Yeah, I
looking
mean,
at
that
this
actually is a really
situation, like,
interesting perspective. Yeah.
yeah,
I haven't thought about it that way. For benzos, we don't really have in-person support to begin with, but I do feel like due to COVID, we're seeing more people in the Zoom support meetings, than before. Um, so I just think it's, even if it's online, just putting yourself out there and attending a meeting or talking to your, benzo buddy. I'm in the Benzo Warrior Community and we do the weekly roundtables, just
nice.
going to a meeting, just showing up, that's something, you're holding yourself accountable and you're not making excuses. And that's very important. So it was a pleasure to have you on today, Dylan. I mean, I've learned,
Yeah,
I feel
thank
like
you. I
we've learned a
appreciate
lot
it.
from each other. And,
Definitely.
I'm just very impressed by everything that you've accomplished. I mean, not just your sobriety, but also your presence in the addiction treatment industry. It's just been amazing. So thank you for
Thank you.
being on this pilot podcast. It was a pleasure. And thank you to everybody who's watching as well. So this is the pilot. And I hope
Yeah,
to continue
thank you.
these types of podcasts later. And yeah, so I guess we're wrapping it up for today.
Cool. And thank you, Rose. Thank you, everyone, for showing up and engaging with us, and keep going.
Yep.